Welcome to the Last American Vagabond on this anniversary of September 11th. I've got a special interview planned for you today. Joining me today is former engineer, college professor, and high school history teacher, present-day researcher, writer, and activist, Dr. Bruce Baird, and I'm honored to have him on the show today to discuss the larger implications of the 9/11, but the bigger conversation about what these events may have been led up to them, things like Pearl Harbor, even discussing things like COVID-19 and these large inflection points in history, and kind of getting into what these events may mean and what they may connect to in a much larger conversation. So thank you for joining me today, Bruce. How are you?
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Well, so I'd like to start. I would like to frame today's discussion sort of in the context of last night's watch along for those that might not have seen, entitled, the COVID 9/11, the security state to the biosecurity state of James Corbett's documentary, and sort of the events that are used to create or justify these unnatural paradigm shifts that we would discuss, at least that I would see, and I believe you agree, in regard to 9/11, Pearl Harbor, or even COVID-19. So really, I was reading a lot of your work up leading up to this interview, and this is kind of where I want to start with this. That you point out that throughout U.S. history, but really in the world, but specifically for the contents of for the discussion today, throughout U.S. history, the U.S. government has always used outside threats, fabricated or otherwise, to serve as the government's primary means of control over the population, control through fear. So after the Soviet Union, where the Soviet threat was no longer center stage as the threat de jour, a new boogeyman was needed. And as I see it, this became the U.S.-supported Mujahideen, among others, which later became Al-Qaeda, which led to the creation of ISIS. Jump to the year 2000. The Project for the New American Century put out Rebuilding America's Defenses, stating that it would be impossible to increase military spending and pursue America's global domination project, quote, absent some catastrophic event like a new Pearl Harbor. Enter 9/11, the war on terror, which used the byproduct or deliberate creation of their past agendas to justify the new one, as we so often see. Then jump forward to 2018. Donald Trump says it will be hard to unify the country without a major event. People often forget that one. Enter COVID-19, 2020, the age, as Whitney Webb coined, the age of your body is the new battlefield. But as your work so aptly points out, Bruce, Pearl Harbor was by no means the first event of its kind. And by that, I mean false flags, or at the very least, an allowed event that was used to justify control. So for today, let's start there. You've listed off things on your website, Mexican-American War of 1846, Operation Northwoods, Gulf of Tonkin, and many more. So what do these events have in common for you? And how do you see that playing into the discussion of 9/11?
Well, I know as a professional historian, I was a historian of early American history before the Civil War. That was my field. But as a teacher, I often had to teach more recent history. So every time I prepared for the next year of teaching, I'd always want to dig up some more stuff or learn a little bit more about each time period. And every time I did, I was sorely disappointed in my historical profession, because it was like, I'm finding different things. I mean, just look at the newspapers from the time. If you can find the newspapers, you find different stories than what's in the history books. Like they drop a lot of things and have a certain slant that you won't find. But if you go deeper into like the documents and you find other stories too. So, I mean, that was disappointing. I didn't know what to do a lot of times with that kind of material, because I pretty much had to teach to a textbook. Usually, I was a college professor, and as a high school history teacher, I had to teach to a textbook. But I would always bring a little bit of this or that, something I found. And the first one I really started doing a number with was the Spanish-American War, the sinking of the battleship Maine, and all the kind of stuff that, how the yellow journalism of the time pushed the idea that the Spanish, those evil Spanish, are behind this thing. And, it just seemed like, I mean, that's yellow journalism. That was their goal, William Randolph Hearst, Pulitzer, these guys, they're pushing that kind of stuff. And so I would do that. And the next thing that I remember really big on was I found this article on Pearl Harbor, and it was written by a very distinguished emeritus, or he was retiring. So a lot of times these retired professors can do this, but he was a political scientist, pretty prominent in his profession. And he was saying that the Pearl Harbor story was a myth, that Roosevelt knew much more, that Roosevelt had pushed Japanese, had pressured the Japanese into, and made it easier for them to attack Pearl Harbor. And there was a guy named Robert Stinnett, who was a reporter in the Oakland area who had written a book about it. And he said he believed this now, this professor, this guy. But I remember the slant he had was that, you know what, it was still okay because he was Roosevelt and, you know, he's making the decision. How could we know what was needed in that time period? So even though he believes Roosevelt was complicit in all this and all the other people supporting Roosevelt, however, the small little group that was around Roosevelt knew this, that was okay because it was probably the right thing to do at the time, was to invite a Pearl Harbor so you can get involved with the bad guys over there in Europe. And I said, you know what, I can teach that. So I had a class I taught with history of World War II. And so I started teaching. Every year I dig deeper and deeper into Pearl Harbor. And then one year, about 2005, I remember a student said, there is this video, it's gone viral. It's called Loose Change. Do you want to share that? And I was open teacher. You know, some students are sure.
Very rare, by the way. That's very rare for a teacher, in my experience.
He brought it up and I said, sure, it's, you know, maybe it's relevant to this history of World War II I'm teaching. And I remember looking at it, and I wasn't open-minded about it, but I remember going, oh my God, you know, because another thing I did as an aside, I grew up in New Orleans in the 1960s, right smack in the middle of Jim Garrison investigations, which I read religiously in the newspapers growing up. I was when a young person coming up. And I remember I went to, my parents took us to see Rush to Judgment. I don't know if you've read the well-known book, but it was a documentary that came out in the movie theaters. And they took a fancy theater downtown New Orleans to watch Rush to Judgment. And that just fed into all this sort of thinking that was very prominent in New Orleans in the 60s. And, you know, Jim Garrison was not unusual. There were a lot of people who supported those investigations he was doing. And I remember being scared to death of David Ferry. I don't know if you ever saw the movie JFK, David Ferry.
Yeah.
Joe Pesci plays it, but scared. I saw a picture of the guy. He lost all of his hair, so he had fake eyebrows. Oh, the guy scared me. I mean, see his picture on the front page of the newspaper. I'm reading about this stuff. And, but, you know, after a while, that all died down. And every few years, I would want to go back and see, well, what happened to that story about the JFK? I mean, did they ever figure anything about that out? And I'd go back and I started doing a little research, and it was a mess. It was like, oh, my God, he said, she said. Oh, I mean, we're talking about through the 70s and then the 80s. You know, I couldn't make sides. It's put it away. And the movie JFK came out. And it's like, oh, I tried to talk to you about that. Oh, people in New Orleans didn't want to talk about that at all. It's like, they're done with that. They're finished with Jim Garrison was crazy. Oh, but you know what? You guys didn't think he was so crazy back in this. Oh, they didn't want to have anything to do with that attitude. Oh,
right.
So
opinions always shift over time. Like we were before we got live talking about before it was, you're not allowed to mention 9/11. Now you're not allowed to get into COVID in certain circles. It's always like that. It shifts.
But that's what Loose Change reminded me of. It's, oh my God, what you can do with photography, what you can do with video. I'm not going to ever make sense of any of that stuff. You know, it's like, and I remember the attitude in 2005 was, you know what, if there was some truth to this, some historian would have revealed this already. I mean, I was sort of still very naive in terms of my faith. And I mean,
if I can comment on that really quickly, that's such that is exactly what we're seeing today in the same right, is that there's this kind of leading like thought process in people in positions of authority. Well, you know, well, if it was true, other people would be talking about it, and it kind of progresses that way. And it's even somebody like you who had, you know, you were showing today, you looking back and you've evolved your opinion on this stuff. We're still, and it's just so fascinating to me that people can be in that position, you know. And
oh yeah.
Go ahead. I think it's.
I mean, I was psyoped about. I told my story a few times about 9/11. I was totally psyoped by it. I remember
we all were before, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. I go back. I've done the history of the truth movement, 9/11 truth movement, to see how slow that evolved. Hit us right before they started kicking in around 2006 or 5 or so. But it was like on that day. I remember I was substitute teacher that year, 2001, 2002, and I heard something going in New York City, and I turned on television, and both buildings were on fire. And I remember, you know, trying to figure out what's going on with here. And about a half hour into me watching television, I'm watching ABC. Peter Jennings is the news anchor. And he's sitting there talking with somebody, you know, John Miller or somebody up there. And there's like some kind of green screen behind them projecting the image of what's going on in Manhattan there, Lower Manhattan. And as he's sitting there talking, the building, which was later known as Tower 2, is like started doing something. What the hell is that? And he's sitting there for, I swear to God, 30 seconds. He's sitting there talking, oblivious to this, what's going on behind. I've never seen a video showing that. What the sort of, they always show them talking. They never show that behind him was a screen. And I said, turn around, damn it. What the hell is that? And I swear, it's like, oh my God. I was like, crazy. And then half an hour later, oh my God. And then I remember continuing to watch it. And at the end, they kept talking about this other building going to come down. This other building's going to come in. I mean, it wasn't just the lady from BBC. It was like all day long. This other building's coming, this other building. And I'm saying, what the? And there it comes all of a sudden. Oh, and I remember saying this to myself. I did over and over. I didn't know buildings did that. I didn't know. I mean, I said it like mumbling to myself. Nobody else, my wife, kids weren't there. Like, I didn't know. And that's about where I left it. I did not want to know about it. And there comes loose change. And they're talking, oh my God, I still want to know about this.
Right. Shout out to Jason Burmis, who was involved with that documentary. He's a friend of ours. But what's interesting is, you know, that in that moment right there, that's kind of the same thing. Like, I'm not an expert on building demolition, but you see that and you go, well, that's pretty clearly, you know, that building 7 in particular. But what's interesting is then you get somebody who steps out as a so-called expert and says, no, this is what happened. And all the people out there that are trained to think like that, even though your gut tells you, obviously, that doesn't make sense, you take a step back and you go, okay, well, he's the expert. You know, somebody else would say something. And they take advantage of people's willingness to trust authority, you know, and I think that's such an important part of all this. Now, before we get further into 9/11 in general, so going back to the events that we discussed beforehand, because I do think this is important for people to understand. So we mentioned the Maine, you know, we've talked about, you know, I mean, any one of these discussions, the Gulf of Tonkin. So in my opinion, each one of these events either are false flags or something that was either allowed to happen or there's a dishonest tactic to it that allowed it to be used for the benefit, which typically ends up at the expense of human life. So would you agree with that? And do you think that would you agree with that in the context of things like Pearl Harbor and 9/11? Do you see those as false flags or at the very least events that were allowed to happen? Is that how you view those?
I see in the early days, I viewed it as our government had a very big interest in claiming the other guys shot first. It's the first shot. I mean, Lincoln did that at Fort Sumter.
Right.
Polk did that at the Oasis River, you know, where our army has crossed the border and they're pushing it. You know, they know they're pushing it. They want to have some Mexican troops fire at them. And that makes it into history books now. That textbooks, they have no trouble.
Now, yeah.
That's so long ago. They can talk about, you know, well, maybe it was a little shady. And Lincoln, that was his big speech he had when he was a 2-year congressman. He ran, you know, that this was like, like I said, a false flag. This was like a effort to try and push war. And then he got defeated and didn't come back again.
Well, it took the very action that they knew would drive the response that they wanted. I mean, that's
Polk wanted that land.
Exactly.
You know,
so this is the bigger question as a historian, right? Do you think that there are any U.S., let's say major U.S. conflicts that weren't started in some way by something like that? Well, you know, again, that doesn't have to be false flag, but at the very least, something that was sort of allowed to happen or that we're not fully informed about, in your opinion, as a historian.
I know that the American leadership know very well how to motivate the American people to get behind the war. You know, you get the other guys, you paint them as evil, you know, and you make them fire the first shot or whatever it is, you know, somehow tailored that they were the bad guys. They were the ones who started this whole thing. You were innocent. You had nothing to do with it. I remember there's an article James Perloff did. I don't know if he went and said that what happened at Lexington was was that there was some patriots, you know, who fired some shots from a tavern there to get the whole thing started. Because always the question, that's one that nobody knows officially who fired the first shot at Lexington. And Perloff said, it was these damn patriots who wanted to start a war. You know what? Knowing what I know that, I said, well, I would tend to believe that, you know. Nobody else has picked up on that story, but I thought that's interesting. You know, I like that story.
Another way to say that, so from the perspective of somebody who agrees with it, the patriots trying to, or another way to say that is agents who executed a false flag to start a war. I mean, it's all perception, you know, it's really somebody who decided to take a shot that knowing that they knew would essentially drive the larger action that would develop into what the social engineers wanted to accomplish, you know. And I think that's the larger point to all of this stuff is I think that it's obvious that you could see that there are government actions involved with every one of these larger inflection points in history that have driven into more control over the population, usually using fear around the event. And I think this is why 9/11 was such an important event I would say COVID's become more important for people being aware of that. But 9/11 was one of these events that people that were in the know have been trying to draw attention to since it happened, because it really is an obvious example, as Corbett's documentaries have made clear, that they are absolutely lying about, the entirety of the story and what it was really about. So discussing 9/11 specifically, I really do think it's paramount that people understand the most basic reality of this event, that I don't think anybody can disagree with when looking at all the facts, that our government and other governments were involved with what happened. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, the closest I've got to that in my own research is as an historian, I've gone back and looked at the media coverage of, which, by the way, you can do for all these events like World War I, World War II. You can see the media, the way it's not just the government does something; the media sells it to the American people.
Right.
And and I found that in more recent events with these crises like 9/11 or this Beirut bombing that I've done, the media has to come up with what will be the official story within hours. Literally, the story, or think of Lee Harvey Oswald, within hours, that story has to be pushed. And then later people can question it. It doesn't matter, because as far as if you can get those first few hours, you got the story. You can wrap it up in about, then you can take care of any truth tellers or questioners later on. You can nip them off or isolate them or whatever you want to do. So with the 9/11, I went back, and unfortunately there is this wonderful website that's preserved all of these network news videos. And I went and I analyzed. My goal was to kind of look for clues as to an official story being pushed. And it was very clear from the first, in fact, I'm retweeting that today, like my whole series I did on that one, that from the very minute of that South Tower falling, collapsing, or whatever they called it, collapse, right? Right away it was called collapse, whatever that was. But within the first minute, they, well, that's a different story. That's
please continue. I'm just showing your thread for people to see your.
Okay. So this is the one I also been retweeting various other things too about it. But if you can pull it up, probably it's coming up pretty soon. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I can grab it. Anything.
Oh, that's part of it. What you're seeing now is part of it.
Sorry.
So if you go to that, right there, that is right there. So there, I'm singling out Netanyahu and Zelikow and I started a lot of times with my threads. I start out with provocative images and statements to get people into it, and then I go into a lot of detail. But this one I usually starts with a question. I don't make an assertion about anything I just say question. And but the whole purpose of that thread, which was a fairly long thread, was to go look at minute by minute along every network channel that was on this website, which I think is pretty much all of them, talking about 9/11. That what story they were spinning, what story were the one they're spinning. And I said it was very remarkable within the first minute. It started on Fox. Fox was the leader in this. I mean, there are these, the anchors of these ones, but also the reporters reporting in are spinning the story that it was quite natural for a building to be hit by planes high up and for them to collapse. It was the heat, the impact, but mostly the heat that caused the softening of the structure so that this upper part of the building crushed the building below. This had never happened before, but it was quite understandable. And they pushed it like it was natural. It was natural. And all day long, every network got on board the story. And also, by the way, Osama bin Laden was the only person who was in a position to be able to do that.
And they somehow knew this within like an hour.
Within the first hour. Yeah, this is all out there. And then every talking head, including, can't remember. I can't remember the guy who was the Israeli former prime minister, but not Netanyahu, but the other guy who came on. And he was saying, I think it might be, the kind of thing that Osama bin Laden might do. But all the networks are pushing it, and their talking heads are all pushing it. But my thing, I was really focused on the issue of quite natural, as sort of my engineering focus and trying to figure out what happened. That was the thing that blew my mind. 9/11. How did this happen? How did these buildings do what they did? Was looking at how do they push that official story? And it was like from the first minute, literally. Everybody knows about the Harley guy. If you watched anything on, the guy who said, I saw it. It couldn't stand how did this Harley guy? Who is this person? He's a Fox freelancer. He's coming in, and everybody said, "Oh yeah, he's one of those fake actors. He's crisis actor. But he was saying something 2 hours after the network news were saying this. This is nothing new. Yeah, he's a crisis actor maybe, but the anchors were all saying this too. So I said, well, to me that's ding ding. They know what's happening. They don't come up with the story. Yeah, 2 hours after, maybe somebody's coming up with a cover story, but they knew about this from the first minute.
I would add too that we people, just like any other field, people tend to give media a lot more credit where it's, a lot of these people are just petty individuals that are willing just doing whatever they can to get ahead, to get the info. You know, they love to call it the fog of breaking news, which only really means they just report whatever they're told by some intelligence asset, which sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes they have information, but you'll find a lot that these people are just trying to be the first to say, which happens a lot in the independent media too today, you know, where they're just trying to be the first to say what they think is the important thing, even though nobody's really checked that, which I think is really important for even back then, by the way, but much more today with how much social media there is. There's a lot of fake stuff flying around, but you can also use it to get real-time things like the people that were down at the bottom who just got out saying, I heard explosions, or the firemen talking about the buildings exploding on the way down. Like, these are things that people pushed to the side today, but that was happening right in the beginning while the narrative was still being set. That completely challenges the bigger story, right? And there's a lot of that out there.
And I see these little earphones they have in their ears, they're telling them what to say. You know, you can see that they're pausing, and then, okay, we have news now. So they're getting fed the story. I don't think they're making it up. Somebody's feeding them the story, and gradually all the networks are telling the same story. And then the New York Times and the big newspapers come on board. The experts all come on to the network news to tell, pretty much confirm it. Although you see these experts, sometimes they know nothing. I mean, they're mouthing things, you know, it's like they're not experts about it. They're just there to repeat the story.
Right. They're the expert that's willing to say the thing that works for their agenda, and that's why they get hired.
Most cases, and experts who slip in and say something different, like there's a guy in New Mexico with a professor down there who said something, got into the papers, and 2 days later, oh, no, he changes his mind. They always change their mind if they happen to say something. They don't know that what they're saying is going to go against their thing. They thought, you know, what they're based on their real expertise, they might think. But they all change their mind, and then you're left with nothing until some kind of truth movement comes up to start questioning it. But luckily, they leave enough clues along the way. I mean, they leave this, you know, media available. They leave these stories that don't make sense for people to question. And I don't know whether that's part of the game. I don't know whether whoever's doing this doesn't mind that there are little, you know, gaping holes in their narrative or not. But they are there, and they're ripe for the picking for anybody who seriously wants to go looking for them. I haven't, you know. So.
Here's one good thought on that, right? So we briefly talked about this before we got started. And I think this is something that is, I mean, in my opinion, I would argue this is deliberate to some degree, because it stops people from being able to see who's the real culprit while being kind of divided on smaller things. But I also think this just happens because people want to be right about the, you know, the division. So do you feel that a lot of the disputes around the larger 9/11 story, you know, like Pentagon plane, no plane, that kind of thing, do you feel that those, like, you know, everybody seemingly trying to reveal the greater truth around 9/11, but do you feel that those disputes can sometimes cause people to miss the forest for the trees, right? Like, we get mired in the smaller, albeit very important, but smaller details, and miss the larger point again, that the U.S. government was simply involved, and we all seem to know that, but we kind of, you know, do you see that as a problem, or, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
I see myself as this historian / engineer cutting through bullshit. That's what I see myself doing, well, regardless of which side it is. My research tends to focus on things that nobody else focuses on. So I'm like, you know, and a lot of people like it, but I'm the only one doing the actual research. They like it or retweet it or whatever. I tend to find myself isolated from mainstream 9/11 truth movement. I mean, even though I'm one of those 3,600 signatories to the petition, the 9/11 truth petition, they never ever retweet me. They ignore me, and other people within that movement ban me. You know, or they keep me. It's like I am like what you would say. I am somebody trying to stir stuff up. I am a disinformation. They don't argue with the evidence. They don't say, "Look what you did." You know, like they don't do that. I get, in fact, more impact on my evidence from like the people who are the so-called debunkers, you know, or the whatever they want to call themselves, the people who defend the official story, and they go after people like 9/11 Truth. At least they did. They usually have a time period they do it, and then they kind of drop by the wayside. But you know, sometimes I think, oh, I would side maybe with debunkers. No, they don't talk about the things I talk about. They very rarely is there overlap between either the debunkers or the truth movement. And so all these other people come in claiming to know the truth, like, oh, they're going to think contrary to 9/11, but they claim to know the truth, or the defenders of those people who claim to know the truth. I said, I don't think so, because here's the list of questions I have, and they can't answer that, or they use the same tactics against me that, you know, that mainstream media uses against 9/11 truth. You know, it's like, they try to say you're crazy or you're full of it, or they call you ad hominems or something.
And I would say,
But
more to the point, that they just refuse to even engage with the questions you're interested in, right? And
right,
I think that's the bigger example of why it's kind of willful ignorance. And I would say the largest point that I think becomes so contentious, and it shouldn't be because there's plenty of evidence, is the Israeli involvement for the conversation. So let's talk about that. Can you speak to what your research has shown in regard to Israel's involvement in 9/11? Start wherever you'd like.
sure. Well, I will say this. When I started my research, I was not thinking about who.
Mm.
I was not. I was trying to figure out what happened. So that was my whole concern. But along the way, I came across the work of Christopher Berlin.
Mhm.
I remember also thinking that there was I had a student who was a staunch Israeli. I mean, he was a staunch defender of Israel in my classes. If I said something contrary or negative, he could jump on it. And I remember just out of the blue talking, this was like a world cultures class, and talking about 9/11 and questioning 9/11. And I remember him saying, like mumbling under his breath, he said, the Jews did it. And I looked at him, what? I never would have thought such a thing. Like, what do you think is crazy? But it's like, that was this attitude, like knee-jerk reaction to this.
Was that him saying that was his thought, or was he
That
implying
was his thought. But
Okay,
he's echoing somebody who probably said, don't question the truth, the 9/11 consensus or whatever the official story,
Mhm.
because somehow if you question it, you're trying to say the Jews did it. And to me, it's
Right.
like,
This is a
that's
classic
crazy.
pitfall to all of the, like, this is the same conversation we bump up against all the time when we're saying the Israeli government committed X, Y, and Z crime in one of these locations, and you get the allegations of anti-Semitism. I mean,
Mhm.
nobody here is going to argue that there's not such a thing as racism or anti-Semitism, but it's wildly dishonest just to label something as racist when that's not even remotely what we're getting into. And I think
Can
that,
you question it?
well, I
Because
mean,
it'll be labeled a racist or an anti-Semite just by questioning something that's an official story.
Exactly. And this overlap is something that there are genuine people out there that would try to make the argument that they think that is the argument. That this is a Jewish, a conspiracy. I flatly disagree with that. I think it's obviously Zionism if we're going to make any distinction, but the Israeli government involvement is really the important overlap to this because it's very, 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 it's verifiable, So I think by labeling it as something as this one grouping of people is involved is about trying to hide that very obvious fact. And I think that's how it gets played very often. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's the way to try and discourage people from questioning. I mean, I'm
Exactly.
familiar with those. I'll with Jeremy Corbyn in Great Britain and any else time it's come
Yep.
up,
Right.
and who those nefarious, Zionist groups that are behind all these start, in the United States as well. There's an ADL or whatever. So I've seen this before, and also the way people are attacked. People who I thought have legitimate questions are attacked by these groups for anti-Semitism, and stops them, gets them fired from jobs, or gets them from being published. And I said, well, to me that raises a lot of questions, like, who is it that doesn't want you to talk about things? So that was also, I started getting a question. I ran across Christopher Berlin's work too, early on, and in fact retweeted a lot of his stuff that he had, where he's basically blaming the Zionists for doing this and listed a lot of evidence. I read his books too, his articles, and he's doing that very early on. And so it's like, all right, but my evidence, what I was looking for, wasn't touching on that. I was like, okay, that's out there. Now, where I got into the question was about who, was by doing all this work on the question of what happened and how it was covered, the cover-up story. That whole thread I was talking about is basically part of the cover-up story. And when I started doing that, I started seeing a pattern. And this got stronger and stronger as I looked at other things other than 9/11. I started coming across the whole group of people, at least a couple of people, physicists, who were working on the idea that nuclear weapons were used on 9/11. People like Heinz Palmer, and he had a wonderful website. I still encourage people to look at his website. But he led me to work with people like Joe Viles. The question about who this Joe Viles was. He was supposedly an online Australian investigator. But a lot of people, there are people who think he's Ari Ben-Benashi, that Whitney Webb draws upon, and Seymour Hersh, that he was all over the place. And he there's this guy, a lot of articles this Joe Viles did talking about Israeli mini nukes, micro nukes, and talking about ideas that truck bombs can't leave craters. And I started digging into that question. Is that true? Truck bombs can't leave. He's talking about all these these terrorist, so-called terrorist attacks where these truck bombs left craters in London and, and the killing of Hariri, the former Prime Minister Hariri in Lebanon. And I started looking through all of the literature, digging into the military stuff, and said, lo and behold, yeah, truck bombs can't, above ground bombs don't blast traders like that. And I found correlations and graphs. And so I started looking at that. And so I had all this information. And then what opened my mind totally was the Beirut blast of August 2020. I hadn't done much with this stuff, but then I was like, I'm looking at this, if you've seen it, a lot of people are trying to disappear that one in the West, but it's just this monster explosion. And I said right away, oh, that's nuclear. I mean, I had enough information and seen enough so this is that. If you read on the main tweet there, I had an earlier tweet right within hours of the thing that led me to question it right away. But then the news of the information about the crater, this was like a 43-meter deep crater, 13-story building, just to put that in perspective, a 13-story deep crater. And it was like 120 to 140-meter wide crater that had been where this explosion had taken place. And say, oh, the sea, Mediterranean Sea, rushed in to fill it up. So that's why you look there at the picture, you see that. And I said, you know what? Oh, this is nuclear. And when I did I did this tweet on like the 9th of August, just a few days after the blast. And I decided to open it with this, again, a provocative thing. Some people didn't like it because I'm mixing a conspiracy theory about 9/11, which is where the hell did the energy come to? Not just Twin Tower, not just World Trade Center 7, but the entire World Trade Center complex. Anything that had a WTC building, and WTC, World Trade Center 7 was not an original World Trade Center building. Is that, Larry came in and he said, oh, I want to call this World Trade Center 7. So, but it was also destroyed. And, I had done enough research and tweeted enough to know that nobody had really explained how the heck this happened. No official story or chemical source or whatever, planes could describe what happened to the World Trade Center complex. And nobody is with 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate is going to be able to explain that crater.
That story was so
possible way.
Yeah, that story was such an obvious. I mean, there were too many experts spoke up and said that's simply not possible.
But so they're both the official stories. Still,
exactly.
You argue with them, and so that said, from that point on, I said, "Damn it, I'm putting this stuff." And I started doing all these events, everything, that I could possibly. I started doing a whole number on 9/11, going in deep. I started doing all these other terrorist attacks in London in the 90s, the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut.
So let's take a step back before there was a bunch of interesting things that I'd like to I'd like to go further on the Israeli involvement because there's a bunch of overlap there. But before we do that, the interesting point about the tactical nuke conversation has been brought up. I've seen that throughout the years, brought up many times. Valid arguments that I've made. In fact, there's an older article on the Last American Vagabond. In fact, which it's unfortunately because of censorship many times around, the actual interview is gone. But it was called Exploring Nuclear 9/11 with an Open and Rational Mind. And people have brought up conversations about, it was written by Tim Bryant, who was an old writer for the website. And people have brought up conversations like direct energy weapon possibilities. Like I'm not one to dismiss any of these things. So what is your opinion on it? Do you feel that was likely what happened on 9/11? And if so, give me some info on that and why you think that.
Well, since I did that original tweet, I've done a lot more research, and including more recently, I started doing the same thing for the Beirut blast that I did for 9/11, going into Twitter, because all the breaking news on Beirut on August 4th, 5th was all on Twitter. Everything was on Twitter.
That's the point I was actually making before, is that's I guarantee that's not stuff people wanted to see, or that they wanted people to see. But if you're paying attention on real-time news, you can get that stuff breaking through from places like Lebanon. I think that's an important thing to remember. Remember, half the stuff coming on Twitter could be fake, but you do get real-time stuff that slips through. And I think
but you do it, and enough has been preserved. I mean, they've deleted, suspended, blocked, all kind of things. So it's not really a great historical resource. But there's enough there, and I look for oddities. people, like with the 9/11. I look for people saying things that they should not be able to know. People, like they shouldn't know that it's natural for a plane to, within a minute of it coming down, it's natural for it to collapse, and use that word collapse over and over again the whole rest of the day and make up the official word for what happened. Like, I don't know what happened. I wouldn't call it necessarily collapse. I'd call it something, but I don't know what it is. So I started doing it for Twitter, and it's a lot more tedious. It's like you're talking about going through this stuff, and also different languages. I'm doing a lot of work with Arabic language, and I'm not a native Arabic speaker, but Google Translate, okay, pretty good. I can use that for a lot, and plus I have a lot of contacts now over these last few years with people from Lebanon and Arabic speakers. So I asked them for help, but I started. The question again, what was the question? The question was about the Israeli, or was it about the?
No, we'll start back to the tactical nuke discussion and just
okay.
What
so
made you think that was the case?
Yeah, all right. So also, I would say the people who pushed the tactical nuke question was Veterans Today.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and I've had actual email. I've been in email chains with Gordon Duff and Veterans Today enough to not trust anything they say, and so I don't know. Sometimes people like Kevin Baird don't like me saying, but it's like I got involved with them when they got interested in Heinz Palmer's work on 9/11 and the nukes, because they had been pushing the idea of mini nukes in 9/11 for a while, and placed within the buildings that brought it down. And I was very familiar with Heinz Palmer because I was actually working with him, helping to edit this book that came out, the Ground Zero book that he put out, and I saw what the Veterans Day did. They would take something and distort it. They would twist it around. It's like, why not just say what he said? Why twist it and try and make it fit whatever was pre-arranged, the story that you already had, which is what they do. They do every time you do it. They did it with my stuff after Beirut. Gordon Duff would take it and use it and try to say it's the same thing that he's already said. They'd use the old stuff. They never edit out the old stuff. They combine the new stuff with the old stuff. And it's like thinking, okay, here's new stuff. I like that because that was something that I said. And they combine it with the old stuff, which is crap. So
aside from the site, though, so what evidence, wherever it came from, what evidence was compelling in your mind in regard to the tactical nuke? Because I mean, there's plenty of stuff that was brought up by these previous writers and stuff that I've seen that's pretty compelling that suggests.
Well, I'll say in particular on the 5th of August, the day after the Beirut blast, I started a thread because the only people really talking about the idea of this was nuke was Veterans Today, and I've tweeted that before. I take their articles, I summarize them. In fact, that's some of the most popular tweets that I've done, was summarizing something from Veterans, and I get a lot more likes than they do from when they do it. And so I started doing this when I was summarizing their article, which had come out that morning on August 5th, and which it starts with the idea of the tactical nukes and missiles, and then they had the thing about this image. Oh, this was a perfect image of the missile taken from their private information, and it had a picture of this thing, and I couldn't tell what it was. I was just retweeting information. Immediately got inundated by people saying, "That's a bird. That's a bird. That's a bird. That's a bird." I mean, oh my God, how many times can you say that's a bird? And then finally, somebody actually these are people who are not followers of me. I'm being attacked by trolls by doing this thing, but the image was of this thing, which they said as a bird. Finally, somebody who did follow me showed me a video clip with images that show where it's quite clear this is a bird. All right.
So you don't think that there was a tactical nuke then, or you do think that that's?
Well, it depends on what you call a tactical nuke. All right. So when I did that thread, on the 9th, I started that thread. My opinion, and it's still my opinion, I haven't changed my mind on any of this stuff, was that this was placed some 50 meters under the ground. That to make this crater, basically, to make this crater, it was going to take a 5 kiloton equivalent nuke, 5 kilotons TNT equivalent nuke. That's a pretty good sized nuke, but still could be considered. It's not a big nuke; it's a small nuke in terms of the weapons that the countries have. But it would have had to been placed 50 meters under the ground. This is not something that a tactical nuke dropped from a plane or from a drone or whatever is going to penetrate the ground to 50 meters and detonate. And also, I realized whoever did this is going to all the effort to do what's happening on that day is not going to trust some missile fired from submarine or whatever to penetrate the ground, and plus all the other stuff that was happening on that day. I mean, it wasn't just that. There was an earlier explosion. There was fireworks sounds. There was fire. There was all this stuff. And I said, this is not. And I didn't buy the ammonium nitrate story right away either. I mean, that's no way. I knew enough about explosives to know that, 2,000 bags of this ammonium nitrate sitting on the floor of it for how many, 6 years, it can just have a fire or whatever that's going to cause it to explode like this massive. There's absolutely no way. I mean, anybody knows anything about explosives. Of course, none of the experts would come on to say that all the ones said, "Oh, yes, of course." No, it's wrong. Well, but how do they do it?
How do you factor in University of Alaska, I believe, came out with their study about I forget the exact number, but that based on their mathematical research, that there had to have been a certain amount of bombs simultaneously detonated on specific amount of pillars for it to have collapsed the way it did. Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, because actually I had to that first film festival I did in Berkeley with the Berkeley 9/11 group. I had to actually introduce some of that information. They chose me as a newbie because I had an engineering background to try to summarize what they'd done, Halsey had done up there, and I followed that for a while too.
You find it compelling?
Well, at the time, yeah, we were waiting for somebody to say, yeah, that story is bullshit. The one about, whatever fires. Yeah, we knew that was wrong. But I was sort of disappointed that they basically couldn't say what happened. They said, yeah, it'd be something like that, which is what we thought anyway. Yeah, it would have to all these things happening at the same time, simultaneously, for it to drop down like that.
Right.
And so that's what you saw. We saw the video. We saw it dropping at free fall.
Right.
Free fall feet. I remember this, when I was still teaching at the time, I took there was an article they came up with, Stephen Jones, and they did publish an article in some English physics journal. And so this is like a real journal. So I brought the article to my physics teacher there, my friend there at school, and showed him, and he said, look, this is free fall. Look, they have the graph, the acceleration of a spot there, like it's stopping at free fall. How can you explain that other than, controlled demolition? And you know what? He actually agreed with me on this. It's fine. He bought the official story about the Twin Towers. He said, but yeah, that looks like controlled demolition. But his argument was, you know what? I think that building was wired for controlled demolition by the powers that be, like the CIA, blah, blah, blah. I said, oh, yeah, okay. That's the way you would argue that, isn't it? Because, I said, you know what? That's a limited hangout. Right. At that point, I was very suspicious of World Trade Center 7 because I know at some point, pull it.
Right. Exactly. You can't.
They're going to say they wired that thing for demolition. And so you're going to put all your effort into that story? No.
Well, I mean, it definitely could be. I just think it's interesting that we can have such blatant. Everybody knows what he meant. There's only one phrase that, one field of work that it uses the term pull it. Yeah. And so, but the fact is that he says that was the choice. So it's interesting that just seems like it might be that even the larger, which I definitely believe is a larger conspiracy, might have just been Singer just trying to take advantage himself and took the action there. But I think he clearly has his ties to larger, apparatus, intelligence, and otherwise as well. So that's that brings it back to the Israeli part of the conversation. I think this is a really important part. Whitney wrote about this. This was in 2019.
Yes, I remember reading that.
FBI document shed light on apparent Mossad foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks. These are the dancing Israelis in actual colors. So, what are your thoughts on that in general? So go deeper into, what you understand about Israeli involvement, Zionist involvement, and,
Sure.
And
all right, I'll focus on that. So in all this research that I started doing on all these events, these so-called terrorist attacks, I started finding a lot of patterns there, historical patterns of explosions, craters that could only have been done by nukes, but yet never reporting radiation fallout. And I started, research. Well, how will they do that? How would they do it? It has to be a nuke. There's no way they're going to put high explosives in there in these sort of situations to be able to do this. So I started looking about these called third generation nukes. And that could be designed however you want. Basically, if you're familiar with the neutron bomb, which was a big to do in the 70s, it's a third generation. It was a third generation, but they've made some which are minimal residual radiation. They don't have it. Or you can make some that are EMP, the electro, that have these pulses that go out and shock everybody's electronics. You can design them however you want. They call it third generation nukes. And Israel was right in there. Even Seymour Hersh said, he showed the information that he got from Benunu this guy who was working there at Dimona and said, they got a neutron bomb there. If they got a neutron bomb, they can do anything. And that's a very sophisticated weapon, a neutron bomb. It's a thermonuclear bomb. It's a hydrogen bomb for all intents and purposes. It's combines fission and fusion, but you can tailor it to whoever you want to. The output, not just this big blast, you can tailor it to whatever you want to.
Wow.
And the United States, 5 countries that I found had discovered how to do this or had tested neutron bombs. The United States was the first, Soviet second, Israel third, and then France and China. Those 5 countries, or all the other nuclear powers, have not shown. They say they might be able to do it, or they can do it. They haven't done it as far as we know. But if you can do that, you can do whatever you want to. Now, all the other countries, those other 4, are kind of accountable. There are people inspecting them. They don't seem to have any kind of proof. But the one country that is unaccountable, that won't let anybody inspect it, right, and that I know darn well has these things, is Israel.
Right.
Okay. So
verifiably, by the way, for those that don't know that, it's nuclear ambiguity does not hide the fact that they've basically admitted that they have nuclear weapons, and so have many other countries around the world, just so people know that. So go ahead.
And people will call these tactical nukes.
Right.
They're called that they're designed to minimize radiation. They don't call them 3rd generation, but they minimize radiation. Okay, that's saying something, because when they drop a bomb, most likely any fallout is going to come back to Israel, the prevailing winds, right? If they're on their borders or wherever they're dropping these things, it could come back, and they don't want that. So they've been pushing, even though they don't talk about it, the people who do talk about it say, of course they would want these kind of weapons. They would say, yes, they would go and steal the technology from whoever, or, get somebody to send them information, whatever the heck it is.
Which again is a reality of what happened between the United States and Israel. Like, these are true, people. It's funny when we talk about these things in these circles, because it seems like these are accepted realities. But for those that are new, what he just mentioned there is a verifiable fact that Israel stole technology from the United States a lot. And these are bigger conversations or even going back to things like, any number of events where Israel's been involved, that the U.S. government's been aware of, that those have been ignored. These are things that you can prove today, So that's context for what we're talking about. So please continue.
The United States is not going to do anything about that. They
Right.
can't. Now I'd say that's a little joke. They've had times where there's been tensions. Thinking, of course, John F. Kennedy was the first one. A lot of people, if you look at the Michael Collins Popper, says that Kennedy's issues with David Ben-Gurion over the Mona project was what got Kennedy assassinated. And other times there have been other presidents who've had tensions. Nixon, Carter, Reagan, these presidents later, George Herbert Walker Bush, they've had troubles with the Israelis, and they tried to see if they could push them, and they never went. Israel has a lot of tactics available to their under the sleeves.
It's not even up for debate.
Clinton, think of blackmail, sexual blackmail.
Exactly. Or the whole Epstein overlap has very clear directional. Even I'm blanking on his name off the top of my head. Acosta made it clear that the Israeli intelligence was involved with Epstein as well. And these things are not up for debate. The Israeli government has obvious influence over unjustified influence over U.S. policy. Like this is what we were mentioning earlier. Saying those things that we can prove in no way is about racism or anything about Jewish people in this conversation. And that's the problem with these things.
I just say Israel, sometimes Zionist. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. It's important.
So, but like this player, we mentioned Joe Viles, Vialls, I'm doing a thread on this. I think he pretty much is Ari Ben Menashe. Menashe disappears into Australia sometime around 92 after, all hell breaking. He publishes this book. The cost of the war. I can't remember, the cost of war or something like that. And he disappears. It doesn't show up again until like 2001. And out of Australia, there's all of this guy, Joe Viles, is publishing all this stuff about mini nukes, Israel, blah, 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 blah. He knows stuff that reads just like something that Joe Viles would know about, or Ari Ben Menashe would know about. Plus, he also was the one who revealed all this, about Epstein and the whole sexual. But he's talking about, as Joe Viles, he's talking about Israeli nuclear terrorism and extorting countries like Australia himself. And then here he's talking about sexual extortion or sexual blackmail too. So there was that thing there nobody's explored. Nobody has really touched between Joe Viles and Ari Ben Menashe, but I think there's ripe for picking as to this guy who's still alive. He's still living in Canada somewhere, and so I found this kind of stuff from Joe Viles, but also started looking at the whole cover-up. And there was this whole pattern of, means, motive, and opportunity. Who had the means, motive, and opportunity? So at each of these events, I would say, well, Israel has the means. They can do these kind of nukes. I know they can go in there and step in. Whoever, whatever, Mossad, I don't care what part of the government is going to do this kind of thing. And they always have the opportunity. They're infiltrated everywhere. They can do these things. They can do these things in New York City. They can do these things. The question is, motive. Do they have the motive? And a lot of times you dig into the newspapers or the evidence that's out there, the whatever documents have been released. They said, yeah, they got a motive for almost anything that happens in the Middle East and elsewhere too, as part of this greater war on terror that they launched in 1979. I mean, that's just this big umbrella thing that can justify practically any kind of action that would benefit Israel. If you can get more people on board the war on terror, or I call it the war of terror, then they win, and they win, and nobody in the media will hold them accountable. Nobody will touch these issues. I say Israel nukes. Everybody runs like a bunny. They don't want to talk about this. Joe Viles did. He's officially died like in 2005, only to become like Ari Ben Panashi again. But
and there's also the financial overlap to all of this that I think plays a factor in regard to the Israeli involvement as well. I mean, I even just recently was talking about the idea of just emergency governance where we are. I mean, we know that at the beginning of all this, there was we never really left that state of emergency governance. I mean, even I think it was the SEC, the Federal Reserve. I mean, everyone was declaring emergencies based on all this, which I think changed the face of all this forever. Yeah, exactly. And I think that the Israeli involvement in that is undeniable. Like I will point to James Corbett's work on the 9/11 suspects and the dancing Israelis and all this overlap. It's very important. But so go back to the nuke point and that in general. So an average person listening might say, why would they choose to use a tactical nuke just instead of some other kind of bomb? Like why do you, what's the thought process and why that was the choice?
And why would they deny they had anything to do with it? And everybody buy that because they say never would harm people. Israel does that in the, they did dead of night. They wanted that, so it doesn't fit an Israeli pattern. Well, if you start looking, and I started with Joe Viles.
No, I
find a pattern, an MO.
I take it back. What I mean actually is more in regard to whoever was responsible. What's the thought process and why they would choose to use a tactical nuke versus something else? Like
so the question, you say tactical nuke, which can mean a lot of things, but generally when people say tactical nukes, they don't mean one of these third generation nukes.
Okay, so
nobody talks about these third generation nukes. They're talking about these things which are basically fission bombs. We're talking about something which is like first generation, more sophisticated this way or that way, but still they're not thermonuclear. There's no fusion element to this device, and they're certainly not third generation to be designed. And the great thing about third generation is that you can make it basically a blast bomb. You can make it so that there's, except for unless you know how to look for these rare isotopes in the soil or whatever, you can make it so it's plausible deniability. You can have the blast planted by a very small group of people instead of having piles and piles of high explosives, to do this. You can have a small group of people go in there, execute this thing, and create this massive explosion. Just like, my God, look at the Beirut blast. This thing is a monstrous explosion there. But I guess still deny that it was that it wasn't. You could say it was ammonium nitrate. People buy it
because I think what you're saying is logically sound. I just mean that why would they choose to take the nuke, even if they could cover it up? What's the benefit of using, and I take it back, a third generation bomb that you're discussing? What would be the logic of using that versus something else? Like, is there a benefit to that, or is it has to do with the cover up? What's your thought process on that?
That it can plausibly deny that it is a nuclear weapon and get away with it. The media will not touch this. The governments won't touch it. The government,
I see. Because of the fact that it's a nuke,
they can do it, and everybody in power knows they did it. And they act that way. They know this is a threat. They can do this, but they can't prove it. And you've got the media in your hand, and you have this thing, and you can't find, radioactivity, which is the go-to. Everybody said, "Well, how can you nuke? You got radioactivity." So nobody wants to talk about the existence of these things because that eliminates the whole question about, well, maybe there won't be any radioactivity. I don't want to open. That's the whole issue they don't want to open up. But it's like extortion. If it was a nuke, then they'd have to say, well, was it the Russians who did it? Was it the Americans who did it? But they don't, or the Israelis, because they know Israelis. So would the Israelis do it? But if it's not a nuke, because nobody will talk about it, then they can say whatever they want. And they can pin the thing on some high explosives, some truck bomb, or some ammonium nitrate in a warehouse, or whatever they want to say, or planes crashing into Twin Towers. That's what caused all this whole World Trade Center complex.
I get what you're saying. So that's I mean, I guess what I was asking is, I think that, in that case, why wouldn't they just then use ammonium nitrate and then but I guess then it wouldn't create the explosion they're looking for. So yeah, I get what you're saying. I've talked about this in regard to how I genuinely think there's an effort in some type of the events like this to seed a part of the narrative that seems unbelievable about a real thing. So it's almost like counteracting. So when people talk about it, they go, that's ridiculous, even though it's meant to look like this. Kind of what you're saying is that the idea of that nuke conversation is the very reason that it gets dismissed so easily. Is that kind of what you're saying? And that makes sense. I mean, I get how that could work.
Well, people don't know this stuff. They don't know anything about nuclear weapons. They don't know, let alone third generation nuclear weapon. They don't know anything about ammonium nitrate. They don't know what ammonia. They don't know what planes crashing into buildings do. They don't know. Then the experts come and say, this is what happens. This is natural. This is of course, the color of the smoke. Yeah, that's the ammonium nitrate. Whatever. Right. All BS, complete BS. You can attack every single part of the story, but yet people don't know that. And who do you trust? You trust experts. You trust somebody who's tweeting something, or you trust the experts. The media pulls out these experts who say, of course, it's natural. This is what happened. And then the story disappears.
Yeah.
It dies out, and only left for people like the people in Lebanon who are still living with it, who the vast majority of the ones that I see accept the official story.
Really?
But yeah, because firstly, in Lebanon, the main issue is who the internal enemy. It's not the Israelis. The Israeli is the enemy by constitution. The Israeli are the bad guys, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't benefit anything by blaming Israel for that. You look at who within this government, or was it Hezbollah or the opponents of Hezbollah? Who was it that we're going to blame for this thing? And in fact, I just recently did a story where we looked at a reporter, an LA Times reporter. He's like the bureau chief there in Beirut now for the Los Angeles Times. But, he was doing little fishy things there right around the time of the blast. And that's the kind of stuff they love, because if you can find these reporters or somebody within the government doing things like that, then it's an internal problem. It's an internal issue. And then you go after the internal enemies. And, I don't know for what good. I don't think it's really the problem. There's a bigger problem than that. But yet that's like the mindset. The mindset is, who are the internal enemies? That we could do something about. We can't do anything about Israel.
It makes sense. I'm not sure where I place it in my mind in regard to, what was used. I feel like there's my general point in all this is that nobody should shy away from asking these questions, because these things all of these have different points. And, you clearly have your background in engineering in these conversations. So I think people should be looking into all of these things. And I think that there's enough evidence, at the very least, as always, going back to the point that I think we should all agree on, that our government was involved to one degree or another in allowing this, or involved in the very actions themselves. And I think that's important. And so the bigger context of all of this is how this event is used to control us and how this goes forward. And so do you think, and feel free to comment further if you have more thoughts on Beirut and so on, but I wanted to ask you about COVID-19. Right. And do you feel that, like even the 9/11 like event that Trump discussed, do you first feel that was COVID-19? Do you think that's one of those moments, or that it's going to be coming forward? And then do you see COVID-19 as sort of like a 9/11 type event, or like an extension?
Well, I was having been sort of made aware by my 9/11 research. I doubted everything I heard on the media. If they're pushing a story, I'm thinking the odds are it's wrong. Maybe more likely the opposite. But then you can't trust the opposite, because they're pushing a counter story, which is also fallacious. But I saw it right away. In fact, I remember up until the August, when the Beirut blast happened, from March until August, I was pretty much tweeting COVID-19, COVID 1984, COVID this and that. Retweeting, but it was amazing after all this time of doing stuff with 9/11. I was surprised how many people out there were tweeting this stuff with things I could agree with. I had a lot of retweeting to it, because there are a lot of people questioning that story from day one. Nobody questioned the Beirut story from nobody questioned it at all, but the COVID. So I said, maybe this will be different. We've learned from 9/11. There were very few 9/11 people, though, in the story. None of the people, these are all new people now. 9/11 people, truth people, were not questioning the COVID that I saw.
Oh, you didn't
brand
see
new people I was following. People like you guys, and there's like, oh. So it's like,
interesting. I wonder what the block might have been for those. I mean, I wasn't actually I never saw the spot to compare the two crowds, but so in your perception, there wasn't much of an overlap. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think since then, since it's all sort of downturn, people like Richard Gage have kind of come on to question it. But that was not there at the beginning, because originally the original A9/11 Truth was strictly focused on this story, about nanothermite and World Trade Center 7. And they didn't want people like me questioning any beyond that, because they said, we got enough evidence. We need to take us to the court. That's where the truth will come out. Not what we're doing, but the court. That's where the truth. I said, I don't think I'm going to wait for that. Right. So they didn't like Richard Gates left because he started questioning COVID. I think that was the reason why he left the group and started his own press. And so there were people who said, we need to do something more than just question or wait for the courts to take in. We need to actually do something. All these other issues that are obviously asking the same kind of questions. So gradually they did come on, but I was from day one, all these new people, and I saw all these different stories. But the first things I saw was just the BS of the whole story. I saw people that were pushing the Wuhan and things. I said, maybe, but all I see is BS, 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 BS. Everything about this is orchestrated. They could have done this with nothing. They could have just created. Although my wife got COVID, and it was something nasty. It was a summer flu, which was a nasty flu. So it's okay. There's something to that experience. Personal experience that I didn't get it, or I got a very mild version, but she got something in the summer of 2000 that was okay. This is weird. Whatever that is weird. So at that point, I said, I don't know what that is, but it's definitely not a normal flu. It hits you in the summertime and hits you really hard. But we weren't going to get vaccinated. We weren't going to say, no. So I didn't trust, and I continued, tweeting, although now that eventually the original stories unfolded and people are kind of moving towards some other position, I'm not seeing so much or tweeting that much about it. But as to where to me, in terms of what the government did with it, whether there was real or not, they stepped in and did with this thing exactly what they did after 9/11. I agree totally with the show that you did last night. They were prepared for that, and they did it. And so it didn't have to be real. It didn't have to be a real threat. I think now it was something to it, but what it was, I don't know. And I'm not going to be able to do that kind of research. A lot of people tell me this and that, and a lot of people question me, and I don't see it really having changed much, though. I don't, like you guys, so that's disappointed. Like the human solution. Yeah, we need a human solution, because they're going to do it again. And I'm not thinking you guys are going to react any differently than you did the first time. I subbed in the schools where I had to wear the damn mask if I wanted to sub. And I was like, God, I hate this. I had this very thinnest possible mask I put on, that was not really a mask at all. I got away with that.
I would say, though, I would add a more of a positive note there, is I actually believe that we will see something different this time. And we've already seen people. There's always going to be enough of a crowd that's going to be passive and that they can point at as the majority. I think that's always going to happen. The media will parrot them. But I think that even at the end of the latter part of the last kind of surge of this agenda, which hasn't gone away, you saw that even the people that were going along with what they did were already stopping the last shot, And so I'm hopeful, at the very least, I'm hopeful that more people are going to take a stand this time. And that might be enough to slow it down.
Too. I don't want to do this again. That was horrible.
I don't think anybody does. But I think that you're right, though. I think that it's so important. And again, we should be watching for that right this moment.
Yeah.
For them to grab that microphone. I think this is the way somebody framed it at the beginning of COVID, is the U.S. government always has the like you just said, they love to grab the microphone right in the beginning and set the narrative. Trump came out and did exactly that. Wuhan flu. They didn't let us know, even though you can prove that while he was saying that, at the very least, the U.S. government knew that there were people involved with what was going on the ground, that they used the Chinese sequence on January 11th to be the basis for all of their injections while claiming China was hiding information. None of that adds up, So I think you're right. I think there's obviously, whether Trump knew that or not is what people can question, but that's a point at which they were already trying to set a narrative when they already knew that they were lying. So I think this entire thing is 9/11 part 2, in my opinion.
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, I hoped that the 9/11 truth effort, which was still around, it hadn't died out really, and the COVID truth would kind of come together to energize some critical mass. I hoped that after the Beirut blast in August of 2020, that somehow that would have added some more questions, but nobody did that. But it's like, if everybody considers these truth movements as separate, and then they're all the way they divide and conquer. You have to come to the point where you question every darn thing, because that's what you really need to do. And It's really hard to exist when you question every darn thing. And you can't trust experts. You can't trust your
Well,
doctors. You
I
can't trust
disagree.
scientists. You can't trust.
I disagree with that actually. I love. I right up until that point, 100% agree with it. But I disagree on the fact that I actually believe that we should have always been doing that. And let me explain: is that it's not just question everything as if nothing, like question everything while entertaining all possibilities. That's just much longer to say, right?
Yeah.
And so I too, I love it. Question everything is so important to me. But I think like we're at a point where we have gotten comfortable, or at least we were, where people were trusting what the government said, trusting what politicians said, what the media said, what the doctor said, trusting the science. Like none of that was smart, in my opinion. We always should have been engaging with it, but being skeptical, because that's how we need to be skeptical of authority. So I see this as a really positive turn back into the way we always should have been, but it does feel very uncomfortable because we're not used to it. Right. And so now we're in this phase where these pockets of comfortableness where we'd sit back and be like, oh, I can trust this and just not think about it. Now we're being forced to question and think about it, so maybe it's a little uncomfortable, but I would argue it's for the greater good of the larger understanding of the truth.
I'm totally comfortable with it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I have I go beyond where most people will feel comfortable going. I know, right. But I mean, I was when we had to get my kids vaccinated back in the 80s. I was the whole vaccine thing. I remember they were saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. I said, well, I never had to do that. My wife didn't have to do that. Why do we have to do it now? How many vaccines right away? And no, I don't think so. We were rebels back then because I was waiting for God. Oh, you think we would say something of, we know better. That's what doctors act. Back then they did it too. We know better. This is what you should do. And, by the way, if you want to go to school, you're going to have to do this, a public school. And it's like, I don't know. I never heard a good explanation. And that's the way I have always not trusted authority. But then again, I bought into the 9/11 thing because I don't know what the hell's going on with that.
Well, that's the whole point about the trauma-based kind of issue. When let's end with this question here, and I think this is important for people, because you're researching this. People would want your opinion in general. So how from your perspective on what you've seen from as far back of these events that you've studied to COVID-19 and forward. How, in your mind, do we break free from this cycle of what I framed earlier as trauma-based mind control, or however you want to look at it, like using these shocking events to either put in fear, make you passive, or really just psychologically break you? How do we break free from that, or attempt to get past it at the very least? What are your thoughts on
that? So I've tweeted this a bunch of times over the years. My idea is it's called the scientific method. Yeah. All right. This is not trust the science. It's the opposite of trust the science, right? It's the scientific method, which I was very familiar with growing up because I was pushed into the sort of sciences. The scientific method is where you basically don't trust your own opinion about things. You don't trust you want to experiment. You want to test. You have a hypothesis. You have to test this thing. And the scientific method, and there's, I have these wonderful philosophers who laid it out, decades ago, what that means. You question yourself. You question yourself, constantly question yourself, question everybody. You question everything. Right. You doubt everything you can say. And then you pit it against the evidence. Whatever you can start with, you pit it against the evidence, and you keep pitting against the evidence. You keep pitting. And when it doesn't explain the evidence, then you try to find a better solution, and you find the evidence. And you never, that's why I don't talk about absolute truth. I put hashtag truth or quotation, because you never reach truth. You find the best answer for the present, for something. And I did this as an engineer. I learned I was a very good engineer for a short time. 5 years I was an engineer. I was a very good one. And that was my whole philosophy. Ask a lot of questions, talk to as many people, research as much as you can, go out and test, see if this works. If it doesn't work, try something else. Right. And as an historian, I did the same thing. I was fortunately kind of a weird historian. That was the way I went to history, as analyzing problems. But it came up with answers that I thought were the best answers. It would leave everybody else in the dust because they couldn't do what I did, or it was hard enough even understanding what I did. But that's what I'm
afraid to ask those questions, I would say.
Yeah, well, they're not going to. They can't understand how you did it, or they can't do for some kind of technical skills, like mathematical skills or something that would require. Mm-hmm. So, but I still say, and I think everybody can do this. Anybody. You don't have to have a degree in anything. You don't have to have a high school diploma to be able to question yourself, question everybody else. And then, I say usually go with your gut, for your first effort, but then test your gut. Does it make sense? Look at that evidence. I mean, what I do with my tweets and my threads is I present evidence, ask questions, and present evidence. I said, look at the evidence. Does this make sense to you? And the whole official story is it's easy to just tear them apart. but don't trust me. Don't make me a guru. I hate gurus.
Right.
Don't trust anybody because they think they come across, like you said, some people in 9/11 Truth want to be the guru. They want to be the person who.
Right.
No, don't trust anybody. Don't trust me. Look for yourself. I'm presenting evidence. Dig it up. I have links. I don't just say spout this little thing. There's a link. Just look at it. Look at it. Link. Does that make sense to you? And when, as Buddha said, when you know in your heart that this is the truth, well, then you can accept it as true, right? But it's hashtag truth, It's like until other evidence is presented. But now the schools don't teach us. The universities do not teach scientific. They teach authority.
Right.
Buy this because Newton said it, or buy this because Einstein said it. Don't question it. They don't test you about it. They don't want you to question. Even in history, what I taught my other fellow history teachers, they don't want you to question stuff. As they question, you can have your opinion, but you better stick to like something you can cite. What's your footnote for that thing? Which means an authority, right? Who said it before, not just what you think. So schools are not taught that way. So for this to happen, you'd have to have like homeschools or something where people are taught, the scientific method, or schools have to be forced to teach it. But there's no push in the schools to teach that. They like their learn by authority, learn by, around the world. This is not, this is like around the world. Arabic schools is like memorize the Quran. That's, you get a PhD in memorizing the Quran. Like,
it just comes down to questioning everything, right? I mean, it's the same point. Like it's a long way of saying generally that you just need to be skeptical about whatever, including your own opinion. And I think that's outstanding. It's a great place to end on in general. I think people out there will, take that in and recognize that how
I hope so.
Obviously people are being misled. Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope so. That's one thing I take when I'm trying. People comes to that question, like a philosophical question. I say the scientific method is the best I've come up with right now. Absolutely. And this is what I mean by it. Doubt, question, evidence, test. Then you have just the best answer. You don't have truth. You have the best answer for the present.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your time, and it's been an interesting conversation.
Yeah, very good.
Anything else you want to leave us with? Upcoming events or
scientific method? Hashtag truth.
There you go. Well, thank you, Bruce. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ryan.
As always, everybody out there, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
Yeah.